This Tuesday in Colombia, the indigenous collective protest movement known as the Minga announced it is on a high state of alert in the face of attacks against indigenous communities in the midst of the nationwide anti-government protests. In Ecuador, the public urban transportation system in the capital Quito has come to a standstill as workers enter a second day of strike action. The Palestinian Foreign Ministry has called on the International Criminal Court to speed up investigations into Israeli war crimes in Gaza and the West Bank as the attacks escalate. From the headquarters of teleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South, and I'm Katrina Goss. This Tuesday in Colombia, the indigenous collective protest movement known as the Minga announced it's on a high state of alert in the face of attacks against indigenous communities and will maintain a permanent mobilization. The decision comes after the events that occurred this weekend when 12 people were injured as a result of the firearm attacks on those participating in the Minga. The initiative also seeks to support the people of the city of Cali in the context of the nationwide anti-government protests. In this regard, Joe Salca, coordinator of the Regional Indigenous Council of Cauca, reiterated that the Minga will not leave the city following the threats issued by the local mayor and President Ivan Duque, but will instead stay to provide security for its members and the wider community. The Regional Indigenous Council also referred to the harmful media campaign to discredit protesters, depicting them as violent and accusing them of having committed acts of vandalism. It should be recalled that several indigenous community members have been murdered in the course of the national protests. An agreement for a 48-hour humanitarian corridor was reached between the Colombian Ombudsman's office and the platform of organisations making up the National Strike Committee in the Department of Cauca, which has been one of the epicenters of the widespread protests against the government of Ivan Duque. The humanitarian corridor will allow food, fuel, medical supplies, animal feed, among other goods, to enter the department from Tuesday until Thursday. The move will greatly alleviate the serious situation faced by the population, as protesters have created blockades in order to protect residents from the attacks of the state security forces in several municipalities of Cauca department. The department authorities had decreed the closure of all entry points to the region from this Monday until Saturday due to the increased tensions in the area. Young Colombian Lucas Villa, a demonstrator shot 8 times by security forces in the western city of Pereira during a peaceful mobilization and who became a symbol of the protest movement in Colombia, passed away this Tuesday at the clinic where he was being treated. His sister announced his death in a Facebook post. Villa, who had remained in a critical condition since the attack, became a symbol of the Colombian youth struggle and an example of the lethal aggression suffered by peaceful protesters as part of the mobilizations that began on April 28th against the government of President Ivan Duque. So far, the authorities have not identified those responsible for his killing. And in Colombia, 47 people have been killed during the nationwide protests against the neoliberal economic reforms imposed by the government of Ivan Duque and the ongoing and escalating violence in the country. 40 of the deaths have been confirmed as due to police brutality. According to the Colombian NGO Temblores, which monitors police violence in the country, and the Institute for Peace and Development, state security forces have detained over 900 people since the protests broke out and committed acts of sexual abuse against 12 women. As of Monday, 313 violent police attacks have been reported and 28 people have suffered eye injuries due to police deliberately shooting at demonstrators' faces. Between April 28th and May 10th, over 500 protesters were reported as missing. 35 of the 47 people killed so far were from the city of Cali, which has been the epicenter of the anti-government protests since April 28th. In other news, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez ratified his support to Argentina during the visit of his Argentine counterpart, President Alberto Fernández. As part of a strategic agreement, Sánchez stated that his country will invest in Argentina. Fernández's visit comes as he seeks to negotiate with the International Monetary Fund for the elimination of surcharges imposed by the organisation and within the framework of a tour of European countries. The Spanish Prime Minister announced that he will visit Argentina in June, together with a large government and business delegation, as part of his agenda to improve ties with Latin America, which his government views as of strategic importance to Europe. Sánchez also noted that he shares the view of his Argentine counterpart with respect to COVID-19 vaccines, considering them a global public good. In speaking as part of his visit to Spain, Argentine President Alberto Fernandez stressed the need to suspend the International Monetary Fund's surcharges on all countries during the pandemic.
Once again, as Spain did at the Ibero-American Summit, our demand to suspend the supercharge on countries that exceeded their credit quotas, which objectively triples the rate paid. I hope that in October, the Monetary Fund will address this and eliminate it once and for all.
On Monday, hundreds of activists held the National Dignity March to demand justice for missing people in Mexico. Members of the movement for Our People marched through the center of the Mexican capital. Besides demanding the creation of a federal special office for missing people, activists called on authorities to speed up the investigation of cases related to missing people and enhance an urgent search program. The National Dignity March has been taking place for 10 consecutive years on the occasion of Mother's Day celebrations. The first march occurred in Ciudad Juárez in the state of Chihuahua, where mothers of missing young women commemorated May 10th and demanded justice. Official figures show an increase of over 80,000 disappeared people in Mexico since the country launched a war against drug trafficking in 2006.
A song is what makes us mothers. So where are they? Where are our children? Is what we shout. Where are they? I have been looking for my son for almost 13 years. They were military from the intelligence area, and they don't look for each other. Today I live in protest and in struggle, with my heart broken in two, because the day they took my son, they also took my life.
And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. In Ecuador, the public urban transportation system in the capital Quito has come to a standstill as workers enter a second day of strike action. Transport workers stress that they are directly affected by the increase in fuel prices implemented by the government of Lenin Moreno. They also assure that until an agreement is reached that will benefit the sector, they will not lift the suspension of their activities. Meanwhile, Quito Mayor Jorge Yunda Machado held his first meeting with the sector union and announced the establishment of technical negotiation tables to channel each of the demands of sector workers. India and South Africa presented a joint proposal before the World Trade Organization last year, calling for the temporary suspension of intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines in order to allow their manufacture across the world. Given the global economic and health impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the delays in manufacturing vaccine doses and the inequality in their distribution, this initiative has been hailed by the World Health Organization as a move that would help all countries. However, it's met resistance from the United States, the United Kingdom and the European Union. To discuss the initiative, supported by over 60 countries, we now welcome Montserrat Nicholas, a political analyst and commentator on current regional affairs. Montserrat, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Montserrat, the Biden administration recently announced a U-turn on the issue of a waiver on vaccine patents, as proposed by India and South Africa at the WTO. How can we explain this change of position on the part of the United States?
Well, first and foremost, I think that change of administration from the Trump presidency to the Biden presidency, it's one reason. And the other one is that the United States have secured a vaccination for the entire population right now. So now they can go into the big fray of the PR, soft power diplomatic war, let's call it that, with the EU and with other countries such as Russia or China. So I think it's more about a pragmatic approach towards it.
Montserrat, there's a strong opposition to a patent waiver from Big Pharma. Many firms saw their shares plunge with the announcement by Biden. Likewise, Germany, a major player in this field, has voiced its continued opposition to the move. What does a pandemic like that of COVID-19 tell us about the neoliberal rules of the game, so to speak, in terms of issues such as intellectual property rights?
Well, I do think that one thing is that the intention from the Biden administration on May 6th was a good one. It clearly is, its interest in the United States is once again getting involved in a WTO, what's going on there, and also dragging with it the World Health Organization in a sort of idea of a plan for what's coming for the future when it comes to the pandemic, right? When it comes to the U.S. as a patent anti-IP protectionist ideas of the waiver at the WTO, I do think that some people have said, and Big Pharma also, that it doesn't really matter, it will not have a big impact, right? Because it's not about the patents, it's actually about the technology and the know-how transferred to other countries, right? And Big Pharma, therefore, is very, not afraid, but it's on alert when it comes to what this could entail, because we will obviously start discussing if IP protections are that important for the well-being of the world as a whole.
An important point you make there, Montserrat, the whole issue of vaccines, their authorization, their manufacture, their distribution, it's highly political. And we've seen certain vaccines favoured over others, not necessarily on the basis of scientific evidence, as seen in the early dismissal of the Chinese and Russian candidates by other world powers and in the media. In this context, how important is it that alliances are forged between poorer nations and, for example, China and Russia, which have shown themselves to be more willing to provide doses where they're needed in order to ensure global access to vaccines?
Well, there are different kind of approaches from different kind of countries, right? The United States decided very early on to secure not only the raw materials to produce a vaccine, but also to keep the vaccination within its borders, right? You can compare that with India, for example, that by end of March this year have exported over 60 million doses and keeping only 54 million for itself, which means obviously that now they put a stop on the export. At the same time, the United States insisted on protecting the raw materials and other materials that needed to produce the vaccine, right? And the other model is also Russia. Russia does have the funding. The problem, obviously, on a global, at a global level, is not the funding. It's actually how to produce it in a high quality way and as fast as possible, right? And how much you're willing to actually share what you're producing within your borders with the rest of the world. So the idea going forward is obviously to create, this is highly important because to create networks of obviously publicly funded, but also publicly owned knowledge centers where you don't have to be at the mercy of one country or two countries that have the specific material or know-how. I do think in the what we call the third world, so to speak, some people would say India is part of that, right? They don't need a transfer know-how. They have everything to produce all the vaccines needed, right? And I also think that kind of knowledge, you can see it in other regions as well. So what's needed, I think, it's a very strong, it's like a position from the governments, from neighboring governments, for example, in South America or in Africa, to group together and start sharing knowledge, hopefully through public universities and research centers, in that way to ensure that future pandemics will be not at the mercy again at Big Pharma or just a few countries. Such as the US or the EU also, right? And another thing is important to say is that this is a big business, and even if governments have said that with the vaccine, this pandemic will possibly end by the end of the year, It's not necessarily true, because even at the JP Morgan's health conference in January this year, 2021, Big Pharma said that this might go on until 2027, 2030. In some countries, because they will not have access to the vaccine now, they're probably going to go on until 2032. And that's a long time, right? And this is only this virus, and we could be we could see other viruses popping up and new pandemics, and that's clearly something that needs to be sort of confronted with strong solidarity between different kind of countries.
Montserrat Nicholas, political analyst and commentator on current regional affairs. Thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your views on this important area for global public health, with many challenges ahead for many nations across the world.
Thank you for the invitation.
And we have more stories up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. On Tuesday, the Palestinian Foreign Ministry called on the International Criminal Court to speed up investigations into Israeli war crimes in Gaza and the West Bank as the attacks escalate. The call came amid the humanitarian crisis sparked by Israel's drone attacks on the Gaza Strip since Monday, which have caused at least 30 deaths and wounded hundreds, and the worsening attacks by Israeli security forces and Zionist settlers against Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem. The Iranian Foreign Minister has promised to submit a motion condemning the crimes committed against the Palestinians by Israeli occupiers to the United Nations. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights expressed deep concern due to the wave of violence in the occupied Palestinian territories. And Israel unleashed more heavy fire on the Gaza Strip this Tuesday after hours of bombardments on Monday night, leaving at least 30 Palestinians dead, including 10 children, and hundreds wounded, local health authorities reported. Israel has launched at least 130 strikes against Gaza since Monday, carried out by fighter jets and attack helicopters, against targets including a school in the centre of the Strip and residential buildings, local media reported. The Israeli attacks against worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque and the planned expulsion of Palestinian families from their homes in occupied East Jerusalem's Sheikh Jarrah neighbourhood to install illegal Jewish settlers have been condemned by the international community. Meanwhile, the Israeli Defence Minister has approved the mobilisation of 5,000 reservists to reinforce the army's deployment. Amid the Zionist violence, Palestinians mourn their dead.
They were playing on the street east of our house. They were bombed while they were playing. They are young. The child was 16 years old. The rest are younger or older. This is the first time the Jews attacked us and killed our children. Where will we go? We want to attack the Jews. We women and men will attack the settlements, burn them or burn us.
In South Africa, hundreds demonstrated in Cape Town to show their solidarity with Palestinians in the face of the latest attacks by the occupying Israeli regime. Tensions have grown in occupied East Jerusalem as Israeli settlers attempt to take over Palestinian homes, while Israeli riot police attacked large crowds of Palestinians at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. And on Tuesday, the Norwegian Refugee Council called on the parties to the conflict in the Middle East to avoid further escalation and prevent loss of life. In a statement, the Council Secretary General urged the international community to use all its influence to end violations of international law, including the forced evictions in the neighbourhood of Sheikh Jarrah in Israeli-occupied East Jerusalem, and to get all parties, Israeli and Palestinian alike, to step back and prevent suffering and loss of life. Referring to the Israeli attacks against worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the Council reaffirmed that the latest violence show that the prolonged conflict and occupation are unsustainable, and there can be no peace and security as long as there are systematic injustices. A business agreement was signed between two entities in the South African city of Cape Town that could lead to lasting benefits for both South Africa and Uganda. Visiting Ugandan dignitaries signed an agreement with Moda Tricontinental during a visit to the One People International Film Festival held last week. We have more details in the following report from our collaborator in Cape Town, Johanna Abrahams.
The One People International Film Festival certainly lived up to its promise. bringing people together not just to discuss and enjoy films, but to talk business. Madam Sheila Abaka Akandwanau and a business associate met with Moja Tricontinental during the event.
We think this agreement will potentially create so much opportunities and potential, skills transfer, knowledge transfer. We learn from each other.
Part of the agreement was the establishment of a South African and Ugandan Chamber of Commerce.
As Pan-Africanists, for one, we don't see why we have problems getting into each other's countries and spaces because we have a limitation of visas and all these other documents. If we have relations that are worthy, that should actually open space for interaction between the two states.
It is an agreement that is setting the basis on how we are going to exchange ideas, knowledge transfer.
The parties agreed to create a pipeline of business opportunities between the two countries.
Got such a beautiful slogan in the last election, securing your future. And the future of Uganda can properly be secured with the interface with the countries in Africa.
Fransman says under the newly established Intra-Trade African Agreement, the parties will also look at setting up a multimedia broadcast agency. The 5-day festival attracted more than 200 films, including the Oscar-winning Best Foreign Film, Another Round. Johan Abrams for teleSUR in Cape Town.
And we've come to the end of this news brief. Remember, you can find these and many of our stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram. For teleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss and thank you for watching.